Thanks for tuning in to the OCCRL Equity Eye Opener webinar series. This virtual brown bag series is a professional development tool that provides dialogues on equitable practices with the goal of promoting courageous conversations and activist leadership around pervasive tensions and race relations within community colleges. The series features educational leaders, scholars, and practitioners from the Advancing Racial Justice and Equitable Outcomes in Community Colleges Institutes. These individuals are experts in advancing inclusive campus climates and racial equity. We hope you enjoy this talk.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Reynolds. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Parkland College. This summer in July of 2019, I attended the first Advancing Racial Justice and Equitable Outcomes conference in Chicago. And I presented on the concept of racial battle fatigue, which was developed by one of the presenters who attended the conference, William Smith. So that was kind of nice. And so when I go through some of the information that I presented, I was focusing on community college, of course, since that was the emphasis for this conference, and just kind of reflecting on my personal experience as a faculty member, but also having several years of schooling as well. And so thinking about some of my experience, throughout school and especially in graduate school leading up to kind of my professional experiences, are kind of some things that I drew from and colleague, feedback as well throughout the years. And of course, a lot of research and reading around racial battle fatigue. So to start, just kind of defining what this concept means. And I've seen that it's been kind of defined in a variety of different ways because it includes a lot of pieces. So this is the definition that I chose, and this is pretty close to William Smith's definition as well. So racial battle fatigue is a theoretical framework used to explain how racialized microaggressions produce social, psychological, and physiological stress responses in Black students and employees on historically white college campuses. I remember when I first kind of came across this concept, it was really affirming to me because, like I was saying, it's something that I felt and experienced for over 10 years, in my academic experience, but there was never a name to kind of add to the feeling or to the experience. And so it was really nice to actually have a term and a concept to apply to this. And racial battle fatigue happens, in a variety of different contexts and settings, but the focus for this particular talk is on the college campus, the community college campus in particular, and that's sort of the employment space that we're focusing on. But I think for Black folks in this country who are employed, this experience, transfers. I think this is something that we could probably identify among many Black employees across a variety of different areas in the US. But since a lot of our higher ed institutions are white dominant as far as ethnic composition, then we do have mostly historically white colleges and universities. And so Black students are typically at these institutions that are dominant with white students. And so they're always kind of the minority in that way or the other in that sort of context. And it's really, even more complex than that because it has a lot to do with like culture and ideas about intellectualism and things like that, which also kind of goes up against, a lot of our ideas about Black people and intelligence and things like that. So who's impacted by the racial battle fatigue? Everyone is impacted by racial battle fatigue. It's not something that necessarily has positive benefits for anyone. Those that are obviously directly impacted would be Black faculty, Black staff, and Black students. But everyone on a college campus is impacted by any, differences in treatment that would, suppress or oppress, individuals or groups on a campus. That's not something that is going to be great for any environment or for anyone in it. And whenever folks aren't able to kind of be their full selves and express themselves in the way that they want to or need to or can, then you're just not getting the rich and wholesome educational experience that you could get. And I think the same applies to, just having diverse employees, at on a college campus and things like that, that just enriches the environment. And so we want these contributions from everyone because that adds to our experience. And so if we have Black employees or students who are feeling like they're not a part of the larger culture, or are having these daily experiences with microaggressions, then we're not really having, the epitome of the educational experience that we should have. I think there are, groups even within the Black population on campuses that are more or less impacted by racial battle fatigue. I think for students, it's a little bit different than the faculty staff dynamic. Students have a lot less power than faculty and staff. And so, a lot of their experiences go unheard, or they might, just kind of share some things that happened, or someone saying an insensitive comment in class, or a teacher using, a stereotypical example, when talking about Chicago or things like that. And many students just kind of hold that and they don't really have an avenue to express that. But for faculty especially, and some staff, we do have the power to actually address, issues of bias and discrimination and just mistreatment. And we do, many of us, do kind of speak out. And so I think that the amount of power that we have to express ourselves and to acknowledge our experiences varies quite a bit depending on the position that you're in. As far as Black staff, I was kind of thinking about, our custodians and the kind of groundskeepers on many of our college campuses. I know at Parkland College, most, if not all, of our janitorial staff are African American, and a few are Latino, but they're almost all kind of ethnic minorities. And they work actually with faculty and staff in a group that we have at Parkland. And so we get to hear from them and some of their experiences of just kind of feeling, they're kind of also occupying multiple identities of being Black people, Black employees, but also in a position that's viewed as inferior to, say, a Black faculty position, or even a student position on the campus. I think, oftentimes janitors are, kind of looked down upon because of the work that they do, even though it's so valuable. And so I think, students, faculty, and staff are kind of experiencing and tangling with these things in different ways. And so I wanted to point that out. Other aspects of impact on kind of the overall campus environment, as far as racial battle fatigue, there's definitely a lot of isolation that we experience. Isolating ourselves from our colleagues is one way that this division occurs, but also kind of distancing ourselves as Black employees from, other ways of involving ourselves on campus. And so college committees and other programs and activities, I've seen this kind of withdrawal of Black faculty and staff from these groups when certain things have happened that they have felt have been kind of negative to them. And so the social impact is really clear. This divisiveness is really clear on the college campus. And also another thing that a lot of Black employees feel and experience is sort of stagnation or an inability to progress to higher positions of authority within the college. And there's a lot of reasons why this happened, and it's not just because an employee is Black. There's usually a lot of different things, but we do see differences by race and ethnicity when we look at the positions that folks hold on college campuses. And certainly within the community college, certainly within Parkland College, we can see this sort of hierarchy that has a lot of racial dynamics to it. And so a lot of Black faculty feel like they're not really able to advance outside of their faculty position, whereas faculty in other areas are able to become, deans and department chairs and things like that. And so there's been some expression within my college of just kind of feeling like they're stuck and they're not able to advance in the ways that other colleagues are. There's also a psychological and also a physiological impact to racial battle fatigue, and I'll get more into the physiological in a second, but they are connected. So there's been a lot of discussion in recent years about internalized, racism and how we sort of hold trauma and past experiences and things like that there's a concept that was developed called post-traumatic slave syndrome even. That's a really interesting concept that kind of talks about how we hold some of the trauma that our ancestors experienced, and we actually have, carry some of that, and it's been kind of generational. So I think that's kind of interesting. And other pieces of like psychology literature kind of get into that as well, with the ways that human beings kind of carry and hold experiences like that. And so when it comes to racial battle fatigue, this comes down in a lot of different ways. It may show up as lowered self-esteem in faculty members, but it can also show up in just stress, sickness, frequent headaches, and things like that. These are sort of non-chronic responses to racial battle fatigue. But there's also more serious consequences to this sort of everyday stress and everyday experiences with microaggressions. And so we see that for African Americans in particular, when it comes to health and life expectancy, and just kind of how well they do later on in life, we see that they're more likely to experience things like hypertension, high blood pressure, stroke, and a lot of those things are directly connected to stress. So I think that's really important to highlight how this really does show up in a lot of different ways for Black faculty and staff. I was also thinking about W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of the double consciousness, and how just kind of being familiar with this concept is useful as both a way of kind of protecting, ourselves as Black faculty and staff, but also as a way of making our experiences better as we kind of continue on in our work. And so Du Bois's concept of double consciousness is speaking to these multiple identities that African Americans in the United States hold. And so this acknowledgement that we are Black, but we also occupy other statuses like being a woman or being poor, or being an educator, or being a student, these different sort of things. But we're also knowledgeable of our position in American society, right? We're knowledgeable of the fact that we are othered in American society, that we are subordinated, and that we are kind of seen as different in the larger context of American society. And so just kind of wrapping our minds around the complexities of all of our identities and the way that we experience racial battle fatigue speaks to this as well, because I think that it's very gendered. And this isn't something that William Smith talked a lot about in his original work, but there are definitely some gendered dynamics of racial battle fatigue. As a woman, African-American professor, I think that my experiences are a lot different in many ways from my Black male colleagues. And it has everything to do with me being a woman and the way that, students and other colleagues respond to my femininity. And so I do think that portion is really important to kind of connect to being Black, right? And how all of these things shape our experience. And that this is kind of a reflection of the divisions in our larger society, and the experiences in our larger society. What happens on these college campuses and university campuses is really kind of microcosms of what's happening nationally, right? And internationally in many cases. So I ended with just some strategies or tips on how to not necessarily cope with racial battle fatigue, but how to ease, some of the tension and trouble that it causes. So first, just remembering our value and worth as employees at these institutions. We wouldn't be there if we didn't have anything to contribute. And we see how difficult and how hard it is for, especially African-American folks, to find employment in spaces like this and higher education. And so for us to be there, we've obviously crossed a lot of hurdles and made our way through a door that many haven't gone through. So we're there for a reason, and we're valued, and everyone knows that, or we wouldn't be there. And so I think that sort of reminder is really important, because many times we do feel devalued, and we question our worth and question our contribution and our ability to do our work effectively. And it's because of the feedback that we're getting sort of throughout the college experience and in that environment, that oftentimes is telling us that we're in the wrong place, that we're not adequate. The second strategy is to resist, right? If we recognize, experiences that are, obviously racist or, biased and problematic in other ways, then we should certainly address that as faculty and staff in positions of power to do that. And we should call those things out wherever they arise, whether it's in the classroom or in a meeting with colleagues, and call folks in as well, even if it's the college president or a dean or a department chair. Call folks in and have conversations about what's happening, and try to work through those problems. And the last thing is to rest. I think too often African Americans are just we gear up and we're soldiers every day before we walk out the door, because we know we have to kind of face this world each day, and this country each day. This country that's kind of telling us that we are, still in 2019, not quite, worthy and not quite integrated. And we just can't, constantly be soldiers and fighting all the time. We have to rest and relax and kind of turn off the tension and the heartache, for a while, take a break, and just kind of know the concealed carry just means just knowing your value and your worth, and also being educated, right, and college policies, and knowing when that line has been crossed. Becoming very familiar with your college practices and policies and employee rights and things like that, I think, are very important. Being informed and educated, and also being recognized as someone who will stand up for yourself, and speak up when that's needed. And so these are just a few strategies and tips that folks can use as we kind of deal with this issue of racial battle fatigue. And here are the main references that I used for the presentation that you can refer back to. And that's about all. Thank you.
Thank you for joining. We appreciate your interest in advancing inclusive campus climates and racial equity. We encourage you to listen to our other Equity Eye Opener webinars, which are available on the OCCRL website. Just look for the project page labeled Advancing Racial Justice and Equitable Outcomes in Community Colleges Institutes.